Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Schools Forum. My name is Andrew O'Neill and I'm the chair of Schools Forum. As this is the first in-person forum meeting in over a year, I'd like to run through some housekeeping for all parties present. All those participating must be present in person, and this event is also being streamed live on YouTube, and members of the public and the media are welcome to watch the meeting remotely and listen to the discussions that are taking place. To keep everyone safe, can I remind all those present to keep a face covering on at all times, other than when called to speak. To request to speak, please turn on your microphone using the switch in front of you, and when you've finished speaking, please do remember to turn on your microphone by using the same button. You'll see that the council chamber looks slightly different to usual, and members of the forum who are sitting to my right in the chamber and officers are predominantly sitting to the left. Could I request that members and officers remain seated even when speaking, and screens are in place between seats in the chamber, and seating in the public gallery is limited to maintain social distancing. Please keep to seating arrangements and follow guidance given about moving in and out of the chamber. Members of staff are available to help, and at the end of the meeting please leave straight away and don't chat in the hallways as the risk of COVID spread is higher indoors. I want to remind forum members that whilst we are associated with specific schools and organisations, in forum meetings we leave those at the door and we represent the portfolio of RBKC schools and institutions as a whole. It was wonderful to see everybody, and what a location to have our first forum meeting in over a year. I need to be careful that this isn't giving me any ideas about how I'm going to redesign the school or my own office. So let's move on to the meeting, and I would also like to welcome those who are in the council chamber and everyone who is watching on YouTube. So we move on to the first item, A1, apologies for absence. Clark, have we had any apologies for absence?
We've received apologies from Wasim Butt and Maria Eliana Arana.
Thank you. Moving on to A2, does anybody have any declarations of interest? Please raise your hand if you do and turn on your microphone. Okay, great. Thank you. Move on now to item A3, which is the minutes of the meeting held on the 18th of January. The forum confirm the minutes. What we need to do is confirm the minutes as an accurate record of the meeting. Is there anything that anyone would like to raise with regard to the minutes? No? Okay. Fantastic. Well, the minutes of the meeting, on the 24th of March have been circulated, not January. Is it your wish that they be signed as a correct record? Please raise your hands. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you. Okay, moving on to item A4, which is membership update. This item is going to be presented by Jackie Saddington after undertaking a huge amount of work in ascertaining and looking back at the constitution of the Schools Forum for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. So Jackie is going to present this. She's going to go through the work that she's undertaken, particularly in looking back at forum minutes since 2013. I think the key thing that we need to focus on in this item is looking at the proposals for the future. So Jackie, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not going to go through the whole report because you've had the report and you've had time to read it. What I just want to make a few comments The composition of the Schools Forum was last reviewed in 2013. A number of changes have gone through since then. I have been looking back through the minutes, trying to ascertain the membership, because a lot of the time members send representation. So the current membership, I would advise, I'm aware that there are some members who may not be on here, but it was agreed that those who are currently been attending as members can see that term out, and then the membership would be looked at for the autumn term. There's no significant changes. There has not been any major changes in the numbers across the schools. So I am not proposing any changes in the membership numbers. One thing I do want to highlight to you, having looked at the latest guidance that came out last month, one area should be on the 14-19 representative. That should actually now read 16 to 19 representative. And just to highlight a couple of things, terms of office are for 2 years. That's no change to the original constitution. And if a member fails to attend for 3 consecutive meetings, even if they send a representative, then they are automatically disqualified as a member, and the clerk would go back to their group to seek further representation. So I think they're the main things I just wanted to highlight to you. Any questions, Andrew?
Yeah, Forum, are there any questions to Jackie about what has been presented here? Peter?
Yes, if you look on Appendix 1, most of our terms and without being a purist, so I just wondered how we got that back into
yes, thank you. Hopefully my microphone's working now. I've been back and looked through the minutes because it wasn't always clear when the term of office ended. Looking back when it was last clear in the minutes, that's when I showed the term of office starting. Going forward, it will go back to the representative groups to decide how they put forward. So in the case of school governors, we will seek nominations and go out to election. For head teachers, it will go back to the head teacher groups for them to put forward. Groups like the PVI representative, that person, their term of office actually still goes through till the 30th of September, but then I would go back to our local authority early years provider to seek that representative. But basically it will go back to your representative group to put forward nominations. The actual appointment is made by the local authority taking those representations.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Are there any other questions? Alison?
Point 14 of the Code of Conduct, where you cross-reference to the Code of Conduct issued by the Royal Borough, and I wondered if it would be useful, it's the Code of Conduct at meetings, just to circulate that again, possibly even in September when everybody's been re-elected, just so we don't run into any sort of Welsh parish council meetings.
Duly noted. Thank you, Alison. Good recommendation there. Amanda, did you have a question I saw? Amanda.
I did, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Sorry, Jackie, this is something I brought up at the Educational Partnership Board. I'm going to bring it back up, actually. So in 4.2 and then 11.1, it refers to how substitutes may be named. And I have a concern with, so 4.2 is as it is in the Educational Partnership Board, so you have to have some sort of get-together amongst that body of people to come up with a deputy, and that's what I was assured in the Educational Partnership Board we had on forum. But we've also got here 11.1, and 11.1 says any member may nominate a substitute to attend the meeting. There's absolutely no stipulation as to who that substitute should be. And if we are going to have that in addition to 4.2, I would suggest that it ought to at least be the Deputy Chair of Governors or the Deputy Head. I don't really think forum is a place for just sending any old person, including your mate, you know. But as it's drawn up, that's what you could do.
Thank you, Amanda. I do think that in the guidance from the DfE on good practice, it stipulates who are appropriate substitutes. So I think it says where it's head teachers, in the absence of the head teacher, it is appropriate to have a deputy head teacher or finance director, school business manager. So I think it might be appropriate to just ensure that we cover ourselves by saying that we reference the good practice guide for schools forums from the DfE. But it is a good point. Back to you, Amanda.
Okay. Yeah, and sorry, and in 4.3, it talks about the membership structure of the schools forum being reviewed regularly. You know, can we set a term? We'll do it every 2 years, every 4 years, every something.
Jack.
Yeah, that can be added in. The guidance actually says membership should be a standing item on every agenda. That's obviously not for a full restructure, but it may be, as we've got to, you might want to say 2 years, as it's a 2-year term, and see the position in 2 years, or if any major changes. So if new guidance comes out, I'm happy to add that in.
Yes, please. If you and Anita and Ian could go away and look at that and then come back with the sort of final recommendation at the first forum in September, ideally when we're appointing members. Are there any other questions on this? Yes.
Early years are not well represented, and there's only one of us, namely me, and I find that it's very hard to be heard amongst so many schools, primary and secondary, and I think that consideration should be given to have another representative from private and voluntary or any other early years settings. And can you, I don't know, I'm having trouble in getting, attracting attention, getting my request to speak. It's working now, but it wasn't before.
Yeah, thank you, Kitty. Gus will keep an eye on that for us at the front here. Jackie has looked at the guidance, and it clearly stipulates what the composition of forums should be based on pupil numbers. Jackie, would you like to outline the procedure for following that and how we are in line with that procedure and in line with good practice from the DfE?
Yes, thank you. The guidance says that it should, the membership should be proportionate to the different groups within the local authority. We have looked at that, and I've met with Anita Stokes to see that still is proportionate. So one PVI member and one nursery school head would be appropriate in line with the legislation.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Are there any other questions on this? Chris?
Yes, thank you. Mine's not working either, actually, so I don't know if you can fix it. Just a couple of things, actually. At 3.3.2, the forum will agree these terms of reference from time to time. I just wonder what the indication is for that and whether they should be reviewed more regularly. It's usually on an annual basis. I guess it depends on changing guidance from the department. That was the first thing. The other thing was about a term of office of 2 years. I think it's good to have a turnaround of representatives, but 2 years doesn't seem very long to me. That's, 6 meetings? It takes you a while to build up the sort of expertise, so I just wonder whether there's any wiggle room around that. I mean, I just leave that with you, because, as I say, one doesn't want to go on forever and ever, but actually 2 years seems a bit brief. And I just wonder what the plan is to go out to fill all these places where people's terms of office have expired, because that can be quite difficult as well if there's a huge change, because that's almost 2/3 of the forum, I think, if not more. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Really good point. I think we'll take all of those back. I think Jackie mentioned about people serving out terms of office, and a really good point around the 2-year term, because certainly with the technical nature of Schools Forum and getting to know the jargon and the information, particularly around school finances, you're only just about getting to grips with it after 2 years. So we certainly need to consider that, but ensure that we are meeting best practice on that. Jackie, I have a slight question in something you brought up at the start there, and the clarification around the 14 to 19 being 16 to 19. And given that the composition of the school organisation around the secondary sector, we have 2 maintained secondary schools that are 11 to 16, and the academy structure within RBKC, all the academy schools have 6 forms, and therefore that almost precludes, or there's a slight imbalance on the representation possibly of the maintained secondary sector versus the academy sector. So I think, is that something you can go away and look at the numbers on and come back to us on?
Yes, I can certainly take away. As I say, it's all about the numbers and proportionality, so I'll take that back and I'll look at that. On the term of office that was raised recently, it was previously agreed by the forum at 2 years, but that can be set at a different time if the forum felt that was more appropriate. So that is something that could be looked at if you felt a longer term was more appropriate.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. Alison.
Otherwise, sorry, is it possible to have different lengths of terms? So perhaps people are offered 2 years or a 3-year term. Otherwise, in 2 years' time at the moment, we're going to end up with 2/3 of the forum reconstituting all over again. There's too many people changing at the same time at the moment, I think.
That is possible. It's it gets very complicated, and as I've found looking at the minutes with representation, so it is possible. I wouldn't recommend it. On the point of everything changing, I have recently done this through Westminster Schools Forum, which is why I was asked to look at it. And on seeking the membership, I will work with Catherine the clerk on that. We did that very successfully, and by the first forum meeting, all positions were filled, so I'm confident we can do that.
Thanks, Jackie. I think from the purposes of equity, we need to keep the terms of office the same for every member of the forum. I do think that obviously the way in which forum works, it may be the case that you go back to constituents and they re-vote people back in. That's always a possibility. So I think that's where we should really steer going forward. Just a note from Martin here. If you are wanting to speak, if you could raise your hand in advance, just so that Gus can see who's going to be coming up next, and it makes it a little bit easier for Gus to prepare on the mic. So, Stephen.
Working. Oh, it is. Can I just ask about 4.2, which I know you mentioned earlier? It seems that in some groups there is a definition of head teacher or governor. In other groups there's a definition of head teacher or senior staff member or governor. And then we have some that just simply says representative. Is there a plan to try and make that more unified? I liked your definition earlier of it being a senior management team member. And then with them, my second question is about academies, because you talk about it being all secondaries, but actually what if September means that it's primary schools in that group, how will that change the dynamic? Okay.
Yes, agreed in terms of the wording, just ensuring consistency. We'll sort that out. I think we need to go back and look at the numbers again and just ensure that it's equitable for across, and it meets the formula that's in the good practice guidance. But a good point in terms of the primary academies. Jackie.
On the membership, it's laid down in the operational guidance, the terminology, so it specifically says academy representatives, but it may well say a primary head or a primary governor. So that wording comes from the legislation. That's why it's written the way it is.
Kitty.
Sorry, you spoke of the proportionality that the representative is made up of. Can you explain how many for each representative? Because with falling roles in the primary sector and increasing roles in the secondary sector as the bulge year goes into secondary, I would expect there to be more another representative in the secondary sector. If there was suddenly a baby boom, then maybe an extra person in early years. But at the moment, I don't understand and can't take back to my people I represent as to reality is what proportions, how many children per representative.
Yeah, Anita will take this one, Kitty.
Yes, a very good point, Kitty. At the moment, when we looked at the numbers, it's definitely proportional, but that's one of the reasons why, as Jackie said, we need to have regular reviews, and if that may be that it's reviewed every 2 years, because that will change. But it's definitely based on the numbers on roll on the last school budgets were based on, so October 2020.
Okay, thank you, Anita. Are there any further questions on this? Okay, thank you. So, I asked the committee to note the report and the recommendations in Section 6 for Schools Forum. In 6.11, to give consent to the proposed membership outlined at Appendix 2, based on us going back and just re-looking at the aspects of the 16 to 19. To give agreement to the adoption of the draft constitution attached Appendix 3 with some revisions as recommended. To note any additional items or issues that wish to be taken into consideration in review of the Constitution or an operation of the Schools Forum. And finally, to agree the new structure that comes into effect from September 21. I've got one hand. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, everybody. Okay, moving on to paper A5, which is the DSG outturn, School Balances 2020-21, and I'm going to hand over to Amit, who is going to lead on this. Or Anita, are you going to start? Okay, thanks, Anita.
Thank you. So the paper shows the final outturn on the DSG, which is actually the deficit is increased by 491,000 to 5,392,000. That's not as much as we were previously expecting, and I can go through that in a little bit of detail. So if we look at the main areas of the outturn, so early years has got an underspend there of 716,000. Now, we're still waiting for the final adjustment in relation to the 2021 financial year, and how we treat that final adjustment and whether we therefore end up with an under or overspend is covered in the early years paper. So I'm not expecting that we would end up with an underspend of 716,000 once we have the adjustment in the current financial year. The schools block underspend of 541,000 is much as we'd expected, and mainly, well, the biggest item within that was the agreed contribution to the deficit recovery. We've got good news on high needs expenditure, which is quite unusual or quite rare, in that that outturn position improved by 570,000 from the last report. And that's mainly because we've been overcautious, I guess. We've been very prudent, because we've been caught out before where costs had gone up that we hadn't forecast for. So where we had included costs for some post-16 and some out-of-borough placements, and obviously the system hadn't quite been up to date of when the children had left, so the cost has been lower there. So that's good news, and hopefully that helps us going forward as well. So I say our in-year overspend is less than we'd anticipated, which was around about 2.4 million. The early years adjustment of 721,000 shown towards the end of the table, that is also, part of that is also covered in the early years paper, so I wasn't going to go into more detail on that now. Then if we move on to look at school balances, and I mean, when you look at the figures, this looks like good news, that school balances overall have increased by 683,000 to nearly 5.8 million. But I think that this is largely a one-off, and clearly the prior year that we've been through with the pandemic has significantly impacted on that. So in terms of what we've ascertained in relation to this is that some schools have managed to reduce some of their costs because they haven't necessarily had all their premises costs, or they might not have had to have as many agency staff. And also, some of the COVID costs were covered by government grants. So I'm not expecting this increase in the balances to continue in let's say, a more normal year. And the other bit of good news is that the number of schools in deficit is reduced from 3 down to 2, and that is good. And those schools have done a lot of work and done a lot of work on their deficit recovery plans as well. And that's really, I'm happy to take any questions or any points.
Yep, thank you, Anita. I think one thing to say on that, if we turn that on its head, it was an extremely difficult year in schools to manage and to forecast costs. And what we see on that balance sheet is just the remarkable leadership of head teachers, of school business managers, finance directors in actually getting schools to that position in spite of the circumstances. So I think we need to credit the work of school leaders there. Are there any questions? Kitty?
Yes, the early years, as you can see, have made a very considerable contribution, which, considering we have a very, single representative, very small number of children, this is a very large amount out of the early years budget that is being carried forward. And I know we're going to talk about it, but I want everybody to notice that 700, because early years have opened before schools, and therefore, and having many more expenses than schools to keep the children in separate bubbles to comply with government recommendations. We're hurting as a group and have managed it extremely well, but haven't had the financial support that perhaps other organisations have.
Anita?
Thank you, Kitty. And I mean, you are right that the early years sector has not had support through some of the government grants. I just want to point out that those figures are not going to stay as underspends on early years. So on the 721,000, we're only proposing in the other paper that 225 of that is kept, because that's what we've already agreed through the forum. And I'm not proposing that we keep the 716, that we review once we've got the final year adjustment.
Kitty?
Yes, I object to the 298,000 because I think that it should be 98,000 and that 200 should be returned to early years. The last forum, again, because of this difficulty with raising your hand on a Teams meeting, and there were a lot of people in the meeting and you just simply didn't hear my hand and we were all, see my hand and we were all muted. Therefore, it was very hard to make oneself heard. So I would like us to revisit that. I do think that it's an inequitable position that early years finds itself in, where they support, with a very tiny numbers, they put so much money into the deficit.
Yeah, Kitty, I disagree that you weren't heard at the last meeting. I think you were heard loud and clear on the issues that you were raising and that you've raised at previous meetings. I think we're in a deficit position, and as a forum we need to submit to the DFE what we're doing about that deficit. So there are contributions being made across the various different pots of money to reduce that deficit, and I know that Anita and Ian have met with you to look at solutions to this and support your sector.
Look as if it's being supported when this amount of money, for a very small sector, this amount of money is not being returned to the members from the money that central government is allocating to early years. It's the unfairness, the fact that the early years is supporting something at a much greater percentage than primary and secondary schools, and there are many, many more pupils.
Well, I'm not, sorry, is there a hand up there? Sorry, Jagdeep.
I suppose I just wanted to deal with I don't know whether Kitty means to say this or not, but we are actually massive early years providers in primary schools. So Kitty is not a lone voice in this room. That all of the primary schools are early years providers as well. So all of the issues you talk about with funding also affect us. We were open all the way through the pandemic and continue to be open. You know, just I know you feel that you might be a lone voice in here, but you're not, and the issues affect all of us. We've just had to grapple with them in the same way you have.
Yep, thank you, Jagdeep. Peter.
Kitty's comment, the 225,000 in the deficit recovery plan for last financial year, I believe that actually agreed with the DFE. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that's, you know, past waters and fixed.
Yes, that was agreed by the forum in terms of the deficit recovery plan and the plan that we submitted to the DFE and met with them about as well and had to get agreed, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. David.
Yes, a question really for Anita. A couple of questions, in fact. The first one is the two schools that you alluded to in deficit. What is the forecast for those schools in regard to their recovery or not, as the case may be, over what kind of timescale? And the other one is that it surprised me, I don't know if it surprised any other members, that there were only two schools in deficit. I was expecting it to be a much larger number. And you know, it's great to hear that there are only two. But I'm aware, and you know, I'm sure everyone is, that there are a lot more schools that are struggling profoundly. And sometimes when one looks at the carry forwards, contingencies or what have you, it's a little bit misleading. Some of that money has already been budgeted for various long-term projects. So it'd just be useful to know in real terms, without alluding to the schools, are we talking about 2 schools in deficit, but perhaps profound concern about 6 others or more? Just be useful to feed that back to consultative. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So the 2 schools in deficits, their deficit recovery plans show recovery within 3 years, as is the requirements, and we have signed off those deficit recovery plans. We believe they are robust. What we're looking at now is the 3-year budget plans that all schools have to produce, and also looking at what the numbers are showing, which will be discussed in the next paper slightly, and making sure that as far as possible, and of course we know the reception numbers are still moving for this year, but trying to make sure that the intakes for this year and the next 2 years are being taken account of in those 3-year budget plans. I think that's something we should report back to you at the next forum in terms of numbers that may be at risk.
Thanks, Anita. Thank you, David. Are there any other questions or comments on this item? Okay, thank you, everyone. So, Forum are asked to note in 5.11 the DSG deficit carry forward position, which Anita presented, and in 5.12 the current levels of school balances. We now move on to paper A, or item A6, which is the ISOS update and the work of the ISOS Working Party. The lead officer on this is Ian, but Amanda says is going to speak to the paper that has been produced. Amanda.
Yes, thank you. Obviously everybody's seen the report, and I just wanted to clarify the opening statement, which talks about this report being an update from the recent strategic working group meeting and recommending the next steps. It was based on the report that group received. It has been supplemented by the local authority officers based on certain questions that came out of that group. Yeah, that's it. So if anybody has any questions about it, then either I or perhaps Ian could help with that.
Ian, would you like to say something?
Sure. Well, firstly, a big thank you to, great to see everybody, by the way, in person this evening. A big thank you to Amanda for chairing, I think, four working group meetings over the past academic year. And Amanda's absolutely right in saying that there was a really helpful discussion at the working group, presentation from ISOS, and we've included some of the main findings from the ISOS summary in this report. It's also a chance for me to say thank you to schools who, where individual meetings have taken place, for being so open and up for those discussions. The working group did a lot of work, as you heard at the last forum meetings, to make sure that the risk assessment tool that we used was as accurate and as helpful as it could be. So that discussion is summarised here, along with some of the steps that schools, individual governing bodies, supported by the local authority and diocese are taking. But in addition, you'll see in section 5, and Amanda's right to flag that, that was a presentation that came to the working group. Anita's also alluded to it. We are looking ahead at reception numbers for September, and I would draw your attention to section 5 in the report, where, again, the children haven't arrived yet in reception, but our projection is that the numbers will be down by 8% compared to a year ago, and that has financial implications for schools as a whole. And Anita has rightly highlighted in the paper that if that works through in terms of numbers in September and going into the October census, and with the larger Year 6 cohort leaving in a few months' time, that would lead to up to £500,000 reduction in the overall allocation. So we really wanted Forum to be aware of that projection this evening, be aware of the really strong partnership working between schools with the local authority and the diocese, but as you can see in terms of the recommendations, really wanting us to continue to have this as a focus at Forum. And again, as colleagues have alluded to, reassure everybody that the new Education Partnership Board will also have a focus on this work, the proposed reduction, potential reduction for the DSG, but also on capacity and projections. But be very happy, perhaps with Anita, to take any questions that colleagues may have, Andrew.
Thanks, Ian. Just one thing, just looking at this and the discussions that we've had around this over the past year, the working party was set up to look at risk, and it's quite clear that that's happened with ISOS. You've produced the sort of risk factors, risk variables that you're now meeting with schools about. Based on that, is it the view that really this, for the time being, should have been the last working party meeting that we've had, the last one, and to pause that working party and then potentially the forum to review once we get the October census numbers in, whether or not we either reinstigate or we leave it to the officers of the local authority in the work that they are doing? Are there any views on that? Certainly Amanda, as the chair, I think you will have a view, Amanda.
Yes, thank you. The view that came out of our last meeting was there was no further purpose in holding meetings until the census figures came out and we could look at the school submissions figures.
Okay, so if we review then in the autumn term, probably in that second part, once we have those numbers, and see whether or not we need to either recommission or re-look at this in some different form or a similar form. Are there any other questions from forum members? Chris?
Hang on. Yeah, thank you. I just want to commend, I mean, I think this is a brilliant piece of work actually, and it's really started to get to grips with the whole falling roles situation. And in some ways, it's a sort of subgroup which actually addresses some of David's comments about, you know, are these sort of, are the figures that we see and carry forwards, that sort of thing, are they real? So, and that's a piece of work that needs to go on outside. I was just wondering, at 2.3, where we're talking about schools' feedback at the meetings in relation to things being not nuanced enough, I just wonder if that's going to be reflected in the work once the group reconvenes, and that there might be some tweaking in relation to how decisions are going to be made going forward, because the reality is that we're going to, my understanding is that still we're going to need to lose a number of school places, a school sort of year or however it's referred to. So are those observations from the schools are going to be sort of taken into account in the work going forward when the group reconvenes? Thank you.
Apologies, Chris, I didn't hear all of your question, but that's my hearing. It's not your fault at all. But in terms of your point about 2.3, what I would say here is we wanted to reflect honestly some of the feedback we had from schools about the risk assessment tool. And I think really I'd want to take a view from Forum. If we do want to commission ISOS, for instance, to do further work when there's new data available in the autumn, it would be really helpful to take all these views on board and say how might we calibrate that tool differently in the future. I think that addresses the first part of your question, Chris, but apologies. Is that okay? You've given me a thumbs up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jagdeep.
I think it's obvious that we're going to need to reform in the autumn. There's no, the figures speak for themselves. The reality is that we're going to have fewer pupils in reception. It's clear, even looking at pupils in our schools currently, that families are moving out. It's happening quite fast, and I think on the ground we can see things moving. So I think that we need to start thinking and looking at that data when it comes in October, and I think it's absolutely clear that we will need to meet as a group. Now, it's obviously up to this group, whether it's in the same form or other, but I think we need to plan for that, and I think we need to be ready, and we need to be deft.
Yeah. So I think the point that I'm making about the working party is they were commissioned to work with ISOS to look at the risk factors. And we've identified what the risk factors are, and the operational work on that has continued. It's without shadow of a doubt the problem's not going away. We know that it's there in reception year 1, year 2, year 3, and in the pupil numbers coming through the school system. I suppose it's about what the next steps look like on an operational basis, and how the local authority are going to work with schools governing bodies, in order to make either big decisions or how we reverse it. Whether that's a working party to look at the issues, I'm not sure what it is. We've got the issues. It's about what the actions are now. So, Ian.
Stream, thank you. A really helpful point, Jagdeep, and as you know, a number of us, myself and Nita in particular, are doing this work in our partner borough in Westminster, and I'm continually reminded that it's really good that we've got to this early, that we are ahead of the curve. I think David commented on the relatively small number of schools in deficits with clear recovery plans in place, but given that drop in numbers, across London, in our big cities, the other factors we're aware of, families that left the capital before lockdown, the impact of Brexit, we absolutely do need to keep an eye on this. And if we do go back to one of the ISOS recommendations with regard to addressing spare capacity, the recommendation was at that time to reduce the forms of entry by between 2 to 3 forms of entry, so a reduction overall of 60 to 90 places in reception going forward each year. We have referred here in 4.2 to the fact that one school has formally made that change and has sought to make a prescribed alteration. That school is St Mary's, Roman Catholic Primary School in North Kensington. We've reported that, and I've reported that just now, because it's a decision that's been made by the governing body and it's in the public domain. But I wanted to reassure you that other schools, particularly 2 formentary schools and 1.5 formentary schools, where there is some spare capacity, are looking at or have already agreed temporary caps and are considering where that may be appropriate and where it works for that school, to make some of those changes permanent. And of course we would report that back here at Forum and at the Education Partnership Board, where it's in the public domain. The last thing I would say is with 1 formentary schools, obviously there's not going to be a capping arrangement to half form of entry, a village school arrangement. That's not something I don't think either local authority or Forum would support. But clearly that there's some really innovative work happening in 1 formentary schools that aren't currently full, whether that's through some of the partnership arrangements that's set out in 4.1, and I think part of our role at the local authority is to share that good practice and help to maintain the breadth of the curriculum offer and the high standards that we continue to enjoy in the Royal Borough.
Yeah, thank you. And I certainly think we're going to see this as a staple item on Forum for the next few years. Maybe it might not be ISOS, it depends on whether or not we recommission, but certainly pressures within the school system around numbers. Peter?
I agree with everybody. This is a continuing issue. The issue I have, or at least the balance I have, is if you want the ISOS rankings done every year, then I think that does need a specialist working group to oversee it for reasons of confidentiality and reviewing the model and various other things. I think that we got a number of technical issues sorted through that process. However, if the feeling is that we don't need it done every year, then I think the officers can report straight to Forum without any big issues arising, because I'm aware, and thanks to everybody who participated, especially the chair, that there was actually quite a lot of work done in the process. So it's a question really as to how frequently, in my view, question in my view of how frequently does the model need to be repeated.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Peter. So I suppose officers need to go back and look at how they can replicate some of the data around that, looking at those risk factors and how well it can be presented to schools and who the right people are to sit and be looking at that on in effect behalf of other schools, because that is often, from a relationship point of view, particularly in the primary sector, quite awkward. So I think we will, well, Anita and Ian will obviously go away and look at this and present a view at the start of next academic year. Is there anything else on the ISOS update? Stephen?
Sorry, it might be a slightly mute point here, but under 4.5, there's a stray paragraph, I think, or maybe not. I suppose my thoughts on this is I'm not really certain about what our timeline is for decision making and when things need to be done by. But that second paragraph reads as if it's nothing to do with early years. It talks about long-term solutions and a vision for the whole school system. I know yesterday or the day before there was a very interesting publication about future-proofing school sites, and I wondered whether someone could explain really what this engaging schools, diocese and MATs, given we don't actually have any MATs yet, actually means.
Ian, is that something you'll work with the diocese, both dioceses?
Absolutely, and thank you, Stephen. That's a helpful question. I think we, some of you were at our first Education Partnership Board meeting a couple of weeks ago. That is definitely a topic I think the Partnership Board will welcome views from Forum about how we might take some of this strategic work forward. But to my mind, one of the roles of the Partnership Board, being a strategic body, would be to think about the vision of the whole school system 5, 10 years from now, how we maintain the excellent quality of provision that we have, the breadth of the curriculum offer, and that might well be a discussion at the Partnership Board, because we recognise, as all of you have said, that the risks are there, and we expect those risk factors to continue to be there. So in that context, how might we build on some of the good practice, some of the innovation, and obviously we've mentioned a couple of examples there about how that vision might continue to be delivered, but to develop that vision very much, with a whole system approach. So my thinking would be that's perhaps a conversation we can pick up at the next meeting of the Partnership Board in September.
Thank you, Ian. Anything else? Okay, thank you, everybody. I ask the committee to note the report and the recommendations in section 7, that is 7.11, the declining reception numbers, or to consider the declining reception numbers projected for September 21, and the probable negative impact on budgets for 22-23, which is expected to be an overall reduction of around £500,000, and for us to agree that further meetings will take place with schools deemed to be at high risk this summer and into the autumn to help them develop plans to mitigate risk, and pending a further report to Forum and the Educational Partnership Board in the autumn. Do we agree to that work of the local authority? Great, thank you, everybody. We now move on to paper A7, which is early years funding, which we asked for this to be produced at the last forum based on some of the questions that Kitty had. Amit, are you leading this report?
Hi, yes, thank you. So the report is split into, well, there's two kind of parts to it. So the first part is, as you say, to answer some of those questions that came up at the last forum. And the second part is around the frequency of payments to early years providers, which I think Iraklis is going to talk through. So the first part, we have shown the contributions towards the deficit recovery from the early years block over the last 3 years, and that's shown in Table 1. You'll see the 2021 figure isn't finalized because of the final adjustment not yet having been made, but you'll also see the 721 prior year adjustment in there, which was in the previous DSG out 10 paper. And the proposal in this paper is to distribute 496,000 of that underspend to providers, which equates to 37 pence per hour as additional funding, which would make that underspend the 225, which is in the DSG deficit management plan. Then the paper also breaks down the spend on the centrally retained budgets that the local authority retains, which is shown in table 2, and yeah, there's the overall underspends on those budgets over the last 3 years, and the contingency budgets in table 3. So the contingency is currently set at 4% of the total pass-through budget. We've also got a note in here around the maintained nursery supplement. There's another question that came up at the last forum, and that is being reviewed with the maintained nurseries in the borough, and we will report back with recommendations at the next forum for that. So I'll maybe pause there for comments, and then Eric Gotaraklis.
Thank you, Amit. Am I right in reading this that we now have a better system for reviewing underspends and where we place that money in comparison to previous years in that early years block?
Yes, sorry, should have mentioned also the other thing we're proposing is looking at the prior year adjustment each year after the year end and then making a decision on what to do if there is a greater underspend than expected. So we haven't done that in the past, but we're proposing to do that going forward now.
Okay, so Kitty, I imagine you've got a question on this. I certainly think from the last forum, I asked the officers to go away and ensure that they looked at and looked at your concerns to ensure that there was a more transparent system of where the funding was going. So Kitty, do you have any questions on this one? Over to you.
Yes, thank you. I mean, you've done a brilliant job on this, and it is gloriously clear where the money's coming from, going to, and the like. So thank you. And it's also clear that early years have had more of an underspend, which has gone into the central deficit than schools. And I think what I'd like to ask is that as a forum we agree what percentage of our budgets, whether it's 1%, 2%, and so that there is both transparency and an agreement about how much we, each group tries to put aside for the deficit recovery, rather than at the moment the early years has put in rather more than everybody else, and I'd like going forward it to be on the same proportion as perhaps we have representatives.
Yeah, I think certainly, well, Anita will answer this, but I think that was certainly the aim of this paper, the aim of this task. It doesn't necessarily write what you might think of the wrongs of the past, but certainly going forward in the future, it will hopefully make a difference to the early years sector. Anita?
Thank you. You're absolutely right, Andrew. The point is that we try and make it clear and fair going forward, and my view would be that if there is an underspend on early years going forward, apart from perhaps if it's on CENEF, which I think we'd need to review, that as far as possible that money was allocated to early years providers.
Thanks, Anita. Jagdeep.
Obviously 7.2 is really welcome, so thank you. Just a couple of questions on technical things around that. Which census are you going to use to allocate that? And then obviously there are several providers, sadly, that haven't survived the 1920 year. So obviously you won't be allocating money to providers that no longer exist. How are you then going to work that bit out?
Yes, so yeah, it would be based on the 1920 census numbers, but yeah, we'd have to. We obviously wouldn't be able to fund providers that don't exist, but it would. The estimated amount is the 37 pence, but if there's a difference in the numbers, then that amount will change to reflect what we're funding. I think. Yeah.
Is when you come to the next forum.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Jagdeep. Any other questions on this? Peter?
The timing of early years payments to providers, because I have some comments on that.
Amit?
Well,
Yes, so I think Iraklis is going to talk to that part now. Yeah.
Okay, are we coming on to answer that now? Yeah, Iraklis, do you want to answer that now?
Thank you. I'll just briefly go through the paper and then I will come back to your questions, Peter. So you would have read the report that outlines that as a local authority we have a statutory duty to make monthly payments to our early years providers unless we have a good reason not to do so. For different reasons, we have not consulted with the early years sector on this matter up until now, so we're proposing to go out to our early years providers and our schools in the autumn term and find out if this would be a suitable way to make payments for early years places. We are proposing to do that in two phases. Phase one would involve the PVI sector, the private, voluntary and independent sector, and childminders as well as academies, mainly due to the fact that the PVI sector already uses the system called Synergy for the payments, and it would be a lot easier for them to continue to do so. And then phase two would involve us consulting with schools and maintain nursery schools as the way that they will be receiving the payments and the administration around it will change for them. So some of the benefits that we have included in the paper include greater flexibility for families, accuracy of payments, and one of the key issues with the current system is that for the PVI sector, the current payments are based on estimates that PVI settings submit before the term. Obviously, they're due to receive the payment, and then adjustments are being made. Which has meant that some of our smaller providers have ended up in arrears at times, and they find themselves in difficult situations where they have to pay large sums of money back to the local authority. But also thinking about families and ability to move between providers, but also for families that are new to the borough, the monthly payments would enable their child to have access to the early years funding from the first day they attend provision, whereas now if they have started mid-term and they have missed the cut-off date, in essence very often parents are expected to pay that bill until the following term. Obviously it will depend on what the consultation will sort of highlight in terms of the schools and PVI settings preference, but we are keen to find out whether this is the best way for our local authority to make the early years payments. Okay.
Thank you, Iraklis. Any questions, Peter?
Two issues. Two sets of issues. I mean, I see what you're trying to get at, and I'm not. We've had trouble at Avondale and St Anne's about precisely the issue you're talking about people coming and going, and well, it's children coming and going, and the balancing of payments with the authority. The first issue I have is on 7.5 and the phasing. It seems to me this is very rapid for the PVI sector, who let's be blunt, have probably got the weakest sets of financial control in the whole of the sort of borough population of schools and education institutions. And I would have thought, and Kitty may have her own view on this, that it was probably best to leave it until, well, carry out your consultation, but actually phase it in a year from September 21, i.e. 22, so there was a good time to set out the procedures involved. And turning to the procedures involved, I've often in Avondale finance meetings likened the system to a small business, which I find quite useful analogy, particularly as I've been involved in running one or two. Can you give us some idea as to how the monthly cash flow cycle will occur? Because it seems to me that you're going to have to take a monthly census at some point. You're then going to have to compute a payment, and the payment must be in the bank account of the nursery before the major payment is made, which is staff, which is made in Avondale's case, I think around the third week of the month, so that it can go through the process of going through the salary and taxation provider, service provider, and go into nursery staff's accounts. And I just would like, before we embark on this, an idea as to how you think this will work, particularly given the fact that, especially now, these schools are running on very low working capital balances, so that the money must actually be in the accounts for the, come hell or high water, by whatever date it is, for the salaries to be paid. Because the last thing I want to have happen here is that salaries, legally contracted salaries, are not paid. Thank you.
Iraklis.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for your question, a really good question, and it is something that has come up in some consultations we have carried out with a few PVI providers and other colleagues. We have spoken to other local authorities who have introduced monthly payments, and they have been doing so for the past 3 years, and a model that seems to be working well is by having the portal open for 3 weeks. Providers are able to add any new child who arrives at the setting or any child who has left, and the idea is that the portal will be open the last month before the following month, if you like, and for the first 2 weeks of each month. So payments can be made in week 3, so that will enable settings in many ways to receive the monies in good time to pay for salaries and for the other things that you've highlighted. Obviously, this is a new system for us. However, for the PVI sector, it will not be significant change, as they already have login details for the existing system. The main difference will be that rather than having to log on 6 times a year to complete the information, they will have to do it on a monthly basis. But the feedback we have had from other local authorities has been that the majority of work goes in September, and then it's a matter of updating it on a monthly basis, if that makes sense. So it seems to be an easy task and not too admin heavy.
Peter, does that alleviate your concerns?
Yeah, I mean, so long these issues have been considered, because as I say, the last thing I want to have happen is, a failure in the system causing a lot of nursery officers, not to get paid. And I repeat, the issues we are finding, we're finding at Avondale and St Anne's, this organisation has a very low working capital balance now, and therefore, things can't be missed. But if that's taken into account, as I said at the start of my comments, I can see the benefits of the system. and I'm not standing in the system's way, so to speak. I'm not standing in the way of the adoption of the system.
Yeah, I think it's a point really well raised. I think crucially, you know, we can't as a forum preside over or sanction a system that results in people not being paid properly and on time. So certainly I think the authority will have to go away and look at how that will be rolled out, the systems in place for that, so that organisations can work well with it. Kitty.
My colleagues in the early years were concerned that when a child leaves, that they should continue to be paid until at least the end of the term, because they've obviously budgeted for a member of staff to be with those children. That will have an impact, because obviously if it's because some parents have moved, particularly those who are funded, and then moved from one area of the borough to the other because they've moved house, it is right that they should be able to go to a new nursery, but equally it's right that the nursery who's had them doesn't find themselves in a financial difficulties because perhaps twins, which can make a significant difference to your class, have moved. So yes, will there be a sort of contingency pot to pay for children moving in both settings? The early years is broadly supportive of it and actually believes that though they're being paid retrospectively instead of in advance, actually it makes cash flow, it normalises cash flow. So, and it's progress, isn't it? If that's what's coming, then they'll do it.
Yeah. Thank you. Heracles, can you respond to Kitty on that?
Thanks, Kitty. So this is a question again that we asked colleagues from other local authorities when we spoke to them. They all said that we spoke to 3 local authorities, and they all said that it hasn't really happened because it was obviously one of their main concerns, that there would be more movement between settings and schools. And in cases where that did happen, the settings have contractual arrangements with families, and it really depends on that contract. In most cases, they may have to give a term's notice, a month's notice. It will depend on those agreements. But they reassured us that this has not been an issue, and we hope that that will be the case here as well. But I understand that some providers may be concerned that there will be a lot of movement where families are being offered places elsewhere, or where they move to a different part of the borough. But I think that it is something that we will have to watch closely if we are going to pursue this approach, and we will have to deal with that. So, but as I said, the local authorities we have spoken to have said to us that this has not been an issue.
Okay, thank you for the reassurance, Heracles, and I certainly think that if it does come up as an issue down the line, something we'll have to review and reconsider. Okay, so in terms of paper A7, I asked the committee to note the report and the recommendations in section 7, which is 7.1. Forum is asked to note the contribution of early years towards the DSG deficit recovery. 7.2, to approve the additional payments of 496,000 to early years providers from the underspend on the prior year adjustment. This equates to an additional hourly payment of 0.37 based on the funded hours in 1920. In 7.3, Forum is asked to note the use of the 5% retained funding on central elements of early years provision. 7.4, Schools Forum is asked to note the recommendations from the review of the maintained nursery supplement allocation will be brought to the next forum meeting, and that Schools Forum are asked to approve the consultation with the early years sector regarding monthly payments as just presented. So we need approval for 7.2 and 7.5. Is everybody in agreement? Okay, thank you everyone. We now move on to paper A8. At the last forum meeting, we presented to everybody about the process for agreeing funding formula options and ensuring that for transparency's sake, and we're looking at this a lot in this meeting, how we operate and how we operate transparently, how we make this into a process rather than having funding options decided on a cliff edge as we found ourselves in the January meeting. So there is much more detail in this report, and I'm going to hand over to Anita, who is going to present this.
Thank you. Yes, I'll just remind forum members that we're still awaiting the consultation about the introduction of the national funding formula, but we know the earliest that that can come in is 2023-24, and we are still hoping that we might hear something in terms of the consultation by the end of this calendar year, but we'll have to wait and see, and we'll see what the DFE say. So, as Andrew says, this is sort of the next stage of the consultation about how the budgets are calculated for next year. And this paper is asking for approval on the models that we go out and consult with the primary head teachers group and the secondary head teachers group. And all the models, as you will know, are based on the 21-22 funding and also all the data, so the pupil numbers and the low prior attainment, etc. So it will all change by the time we get to the final budgets for next year, and that's something we will come back to. As we know, that's why we try to give an indication of the implications of the potential reduction in reception. So there's 3 options proposed for consultation, and the first one is that we make no change to the current formula, which was a movement of a quarter of a way towards the national funding formula factor values, and we had a minimum funding guarantee of at least an increase of 1.7% per pupil. Option 2 is let's move a further quarter of the way on all those factor values, and the minimum funding guarantee increases a bit as the balancing figure. And then option 3 is moving half of the way towards the national funding formula factor values. And we've kept the MFG at a maximum of 2% per pupil, because at the moment that's what the regulations would allow. But we don't know what we'll be able to do with the minimum funding guarantee next year. There will be a minimum funding guarantee, I'm sure, but what the range will be, that I don't know. And then just for information, we've shown you the national funding formula allocations. And Appendix A and Appendix B give you the details both on factor values and individual school allocations. And we've also included it at 4.5 what's happened, so to give some context of what's happened over the last few years in terms of funding and the implications of the decisions that have been made by the forum. I will pause there for any questions.
Yes, thank you, Anita. So obviously we're not deciding the formula options now, so we don't need to have any heated debates just yet. We'll be taking this to the primary groups, secondary groups to look at and review. I suppose the questions are around overall, are they the models that we want to take to those groups? And also something that I noted just in the very nicely presented table in 4.5, I think given the context that we talked about in the ISOS update, that as a forum over the past 3 years we have taken a decision to, in effect, move more funding into the primary sector, and there's 11 percentage point increase there going into the primary sector. So it shows that this forum over the years has been taking strategic decisions to support that sector over and above, say, secondary. Are there any comments on the paper and the plans going forward for the DSG? Kitty?
Shouldn't we be moving the money back to secondary to help with the bulge that's about to move into it?
Well, I mean, Anita can go into this, but that will come through the funding formula naturally anyway as those pupils move in through the census. So when they exist in the schools will receive that money into their budgets. It's probably more problematic where there's growth in some of the schools, but that growth is in primary and secondary, and I think that's in the next paper. Anita, is there anything else on that in terms of moving the bulges, or the numbers coming through?
No, I think you've answered that, Andrew. Thank you.
Stephen.
Sorry, just thinking about the longer term view of things. When the national funding formula comes in, and if I'm reading this right, you know, we'll lose what, £500, £600 per pupil. That's going to have a very significant long-term effect on all our schools. When do we start talking about long-term plans for safeguarding our school provision?
So, in relation to the national funding formula, there will be protection within that, like there is in the current notional allocations, where the protection there is about a funding floor. So it's based on the 1819 currently as a baseline, and then the 2 years since then, it's always guaranteed an increase per pupil. I cannot see, so while the factor values are lower than the Kensington and Chelsea formula, I cannot see that there's, in the current position, that there's going to be reduction in schools funding. I think that there'll be a funding floor and some sort of protection going on for, you know, who knows, for quite some time.
Stephen.
Sorry, I've been around long enough to remember grant maintained school status and how long it took to go through that cash protection of, I think it was 11 or 12 years. And in effect, you know, our budgets were just frozen and inflation takes effect, so that there will be an impact, and it will take some time to really adjust to these new funding levels. I just think at some point that's a conversation we will need to have.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. That's noted. Anita?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I think you're right, and I think that the key thing that we're waiting for is the consultation on the introduction of this, and that's where we'll get some of the details of, because it's going to, you know, probably the key thing is going to be the funding floor and protection for schools. So yes, as soon as we get anything, we will be bringing it to the forum.
Yeah, I think certainly as we get that information and we're able to start modelling 3-year and 5-year budget plans through as schools and working with the local authority on that, that's where we'll start to get a real indication of what the true impact is going to be for us all. I think certainly from the perspective of secondary schools, with deficit in numbers hitting it, possibly as the national funding formula comes in, we might see in the secondary sector huge challenges in the next 3 to 5 years on this. Any other questions from forum members on this? Kitty?
Is there a sort of particular way in which the baseline might be judged, and therefore it's important to bring politics into whether you choose A, B or C, because of how it might pan out when there's some flaw to a safety net? So will we have at some stage an idea as to whether, if we chose the 25%, 50% or whatever, which one will be most likely to give us the best position to argue with central government to get as much money as possible from?
Yes, a really good question. Yeah, it's a good question. Again, I think it's when we get that consultation. So what we want to do is we don't want, we want to move towards the national funding formula because that's the expectation, and as we've the forum have agreed as the principles. But, you know, we don't probably want to have big changes within that, and the way that we're dealing with that is by having the minimum funding guarantee towards the higher end of what we're allowed to do. But again, the key where we'll find out more will be the consultation.
Thanks, Anita. And as forum members will know, we've been making, as we did in January, incremental steps towards that national funding formula, but just being careful that we don't fall off cliffs. And certainly that's, I think we've been taking the right steps as a forum in preparation for that. Is there anything else on this paper in A8, if you raise your hand? Okay, thank you. So, ask the committee to note the recommendations in section 7, and that is to, in 7.1.1, agree the options to go forward for consultation with primary and secondary head teacher groups in September, October or the autumn term of 2021, and to note the next steps for agreeing the school's funding formula for 22-23 budgets. Thank you. We move to paper A9, which is Growth Fund Review. And actually this came out of a part of the DSG's discussion in January, and it was around how is growth funding allocated, and again back to the transparency around that and the fairness around the growth funding options. So Anita, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean it's been really good reviewing the growth criteria, and the paper goes through all the guidance and requirements from the DFE around the growth fund and what we can and can't use it for. So can be used for basic needs growth or additional, basically bulge classes, and we'd have to fund any new schools. We're not in that position at the moment, but we have to include that within our criteria. And it's very clear, and as we would want to be as a forum anyway, that anything that's agreed for the growth criteria would apply to maintained schools and academies in exactly the same way. So it is worth noting that if we allocate growth funding, we can't then if we allocate growth funding in accordance with our agreed criteria, we cannot then adjust that funding. But that's not what happened when I go further through the paper. So the current growth criteria, I'm sure you probably all remember, it's based on a 65,000 payment for a growth of a class of 30 pupils. Based on the cost of appointing a teacher and some set-up costs as well. And as requested by the forum, and again for transparency, as Andrew referred to, the allocations since 2018-19 are shown in the appendix. And what had become clear is, through no fault of the school, we'd actually allocated 2 years' worth of growth funding to one of the schools in error, and we've made agreement of how we're going to recoup that funding from the school. But as I say, that was no fault of the school. Looking at the proposed criteria, and that obviously it's about supporting basic need expansions, be they permanent or bulge classes. But it would only be where a school increases its published admissions number, its PAN, in agreement with the head of admissions and access team, and apologies, that should say the Director of Education, not the Director of Edu. And there is an addition actually under 4.2 on the 4th bullet point. It does say that, I know we're not in this position, so it seems quite strange talking about this, but if there had been a planned expansion and then those numbers were not coming through, we would review whether funding is allocated in future years. So if that, do we continue to fund an extra 30 pupils in future years, or 15 pupils? So that is a change, as is the amount that's allocated. So the proposed methodology is based on average cost of teacher and providing some funding towards resources and setup costs. So that's then proposed at 60,000 for a additional class of 30, and obviously half that amount if it was just a half form entry increase.
Okay, thank you, Anita. I certainly think that is much clearer in terms of how that growth fund system works, and so much more transparency. I think that certainly that members were raising queries earlier in the year as to how it worked at all, so that's fantastic. Are there any other comments or questions from forum members on this? Amanda?
This was something that came up in the working group. We've had explained that obviously growth funding only follows agreement by the borough, the local authority, for a bulge year. Do we assume, therefore, given all of the difficulties with primary school places, that there will be no such agreements going forward in any of the primary schools then, until we have seen the end of the oversupply of places in some schools?
Ian?
Thank you, Amanda. Yes, happy to respond. I think, as I've said at previous meetings when we've looked at the school organisation strategy and in relation to the work of ISOS, clearly the numbers are showing that we would not be supporting any further expansions at primary. As you know, we have been doing some work with secondary colleagues. We currently can't meet demand for places for girls. I wish Wendy were here to confirm that detail with me, although looking at the projections, we sense there will be a reduction in demand for secondary places too, but nevertheless our current position based on the current capacity, the projections we've all seen, is we wouldn't support any further expansions in the primary sector.
Thank you, Ian. Anyone else? Chris?
Oh, there we go, thanks. At 2.13, there's no provision for reducing growth funding retrospectively if the numbers do not fully materialise. Is that an absolute, I wonder? Because if the numbers don't materialise, you're not spending the money. I mean, I appreciate that you might have made staff appointments and all the rest of it, but I wonder whether it's rather an absolute statement. At the very least, there should be some sort of drill down into why.
Yes, I mean, Anita, you may want to answer this one, but I think that the purpose of this was where, rather than committing to an absolute £65,000 per year for the next 5 years and finding out that you've got 2 classes of 30 coming through and then 3 years where you're not anywhere near that, or actually you're far less than that. So it was just about reducing any long-term financial commitments into the growth funding, that actually it's just a year-by-year basis. So I suppose if a situation does arise where there has been agreed growth and it's problematic, then I think at that point the school would need to make representations to the Director of Education and also Anita around that. But it was more about long-term, Anita. I think, have I covered that?
Yes, thank you, Andrew.
Okay, all right, thank you everybody. So I asked the committee to note the report and recommendations in section 5. Forum are recommended to consider and agree the revised criteria for falling roles funding for 2022-23 onwards. And in 5.12, just note the repayment of allocations made to Marlborough School in error. Thank you. All right, we move on to A10, which is SEN Teachers Pay and Pension Grants, 21-22, and Amit, over to you.
Thank you. So this paper sets out the new arrangements of the way that the pay and pensions grant will go to high needs institutions. So previously it was a separate pay and pensions grant. It's now part of the high needs block through the High Needs National Funding Formula. So but the allocations are based on the same basis as they were last year as a separate grant, so the amounts are the same, just paid through the high needs block. Yeah, I think that's what I had.
Okay, thank you. I mean, are there any questions on paper A10, SEN Teachers Pay? Stephen?
I'm really sorry, I didn't actually hear the second part of what you said, so if you've already said it, I apologise, but just so I'm clear, you're not saying that the grant is now part of the funding formula and presumably should be included in whatever ORPU or notional amounts given over to these schools. It is still a separate amount that's given and is a separate amount that's going to be passed on.
Yes, that's right. So it's a separate amount just funded through the high needs block rather than a separate grant.
Okay, thank you. Jagdeep?
It is actually included in the main formula for mainstream schools. It's just separate for special needs schools and special needs settings. So for us, it's in the main block.
Yep, thank you, Jagdeep, for the clarity on that. Amit, do you want to come back on that as well?
Oops. Yeah, sorry, that's right. And the settings that are affected are the ones in the table, in Table 1. So, yeah, it's just those three.
Okay, thank you. So I ask the committee to note the report and the recommendation in section 3 to note the funding for teachers' pay and pensions for high needs providers are part of high needs block for DSG 21-22 instead of a separate grant, and the amount received will be the same as the amount received in 2021. Okay, on to paper A11, which is around alternative provision proposals, and I hand over to Ian.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll be fairly brief, aware of the time, but just to flag a couple of key points from this paper. So we wanted to update Schools Forum, as we do annually, on our discussions with alternative provision colleagues with regard to our commissioning of the provision. A couple of changes this year. So rather than having a service level agreement, we are looking to move to a formal contract arrangements. And as the paper also states in 1.5, the alternative provision offer will be overseen by a new multi-academy trust provider from September. And in the paper, I think we said in 1.6, when the papers went to print, it is expected that Ormiston Academy Trust will be the new MAP provider. That has now been confirmed, so they will be the partner we're working with from September, and indeed colleagues at TBAT will be working with. So there has been a discussion over a number of months about the commissioning of the provision. I think it's worth saying, from the perspective of the local authority, that we're fortunate to have good and outstanding provision, both in terms of what's offered at Latimer, through the Goldbourne Centre, through the Courtyard provision over in Hammersmith and Fulham, which we commission, and also the primary behaviour outreach. And there is, of course, a range of provision. So I think one of the challenges for the local authority, and I guess for Forum as well, is to try and make sure that we retain the range of provision, but we're also mindful of the spend on the high needs block. And it's worth taking colleagues' minds back just a couple of years when we did reduce spend in this area because of a reducing number of places required at Latimer, and that's because we've had reducing numbers of permanent exclusions, which is really good news. Clearly, as a very small provision, Latimer does require certain economies of scale to be viable, to maintain quality and breadth of the curriculum offer, and the discussions that we've had with them have culminated in what's set out in section 2. So being upfront with you, TBAP and Ormiston did request a higher top-up rate than the 12.5k top-up rate that's mentioned in 2.2, but we were able, I think, to negotiate and come to the figure that we put forward here, which is an increase of 2k per place compared to the current top-up rate, but we believe is in line with market rates. There is a proposed change for one element of the non-statutory provision, and that's set out in 2.3. Relatively small part of the provision overall, so these are managed moves from mainstream secondary schools, in this case, into Latimer. 7 of those placements made last year. Currently there is a sliding scale fee of between about 2k and 6 or just over 6k, and the proposal is that would be a flat fee for secondary schools of 6k a year going forward, with the High Needs block continuing to fund the other half of the total top up there. There's also a proposal that those placements are dual registration, so between Latimer and the referring secondary school. Without going into all the detail this evening, wanted to flag with you that in the usual way we have taken these proposals to the High Needs Review Group. I'm just going to do a little plug, if I may, as well, that we'd really welcome more secondary colleagues on the High Needs Review Group. Our colleague head teacher Paul Cotter chairs that, so it may be with your support, Andrew, we'll go back out and see if we can get a bit more representation there. And then this morning, and I recognise only this morning, we had the conversation at secondary heads about some of these proposals. We're not seeking an endorsement or a final decision tonight, but we'd really welcome any views on the stage we've reached, both in terms of discussions with TBAP and Ormiston before we finalise the contract, and of course with head teacher colleagues as well. The last thing I would say is on the final section 2.4, there are no proposals to change the behaviour outreach arrangements this year. That's non-statutory. We know it's highly valued by schools. There were changes made a couple of years ago, and there was a reduction in the spend on primary behaviour outreach. That's still funded to the tune of £100,000, and there's no proposal to change what local authority commissions at the Goulburn Centre, which is secondary provision, nor to propose an increase in what schools pay. So really welcome any views and feedback, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I think the first thing to say on this, as we said it at the secondary group this morning, is that it's a real relief that somebody has stepped in, a sponsor has stepped in to take over TBAP, because as a forum, if we go back a couple of years, I think we moved 0.25% across from the DSG to support enabling and sustaining that alternative provision. So that is really good news. Are there any comments on some of the proposals here? And I think from the meeting this morning, some secondary colleagues will have some, but Amanda.
Thank you. As somebody who's sat on innumerable exclusion panels, it's always a comfort when one has to exclude a student or a pupil that they are provided with some excellence in their next stage, or indeed, if we're able to avoid a permanent exclusion through a managed move, then terrific. And I think it's particularly important at the moment, given the drive to reduce the number of permanent exclusions, that we support the additional funding for our alternative provision. I think it does an extremely good job. It is extremely valuable.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. David.
Thank you, Andrew. Really conscious of the time as well, and I completely accept how difficult this process has been to try and rebroker TBAP. I'm really pleased too that Ormiston are coming on board. I note what you said about representation on the high needs block as well. I heard that. This was discussed Kensington Chelsea secondary heads this morning, and also Westminster recently. I think it's fair to say there's significant concern about the proposal, the way it's presented at the moment, over the dual registration idea, both in terms of the potential costs to the school. I get that costs have to go up in some way, and we'll have to take our share of the burden there, but also in terms of the exposure that schools will have over the results of those students. And I know what you're saying, it's a small element, but I actually think in some ways, given the sensitivity around exclusion that Amanda's alluded to, and feelings, in terms of Ofsted and in terms of the wider community, it's quite a big element. And I'm worried that if it goes through like this, it could actually, I know this isn't what's intended, but it could actually lead to an increase in permanent exclusions. So I think it's possible to get this sorted quickly, but to get it sorted in a way which everyone is happy with. And as a secondary school, people might not know this, but we are doing a lot of work with TBAT, more so than other secondary schools in the borough. And I'd be really happy to work on it with Mariella at Chelsea Academy. We talked about maybe Andrew also in North Kensington does quite a lot of work with them, and any Westminster heads, and also colleagues like Wasim at TBAT and yourself, Ian. But I mean, I couldn't support this the way it's presented today. I don't think that element of it is correct at the moment.
Yes, I think Ian alluded to that, and totally agree. There's some real concerns there. There was discussion this morning with heads in secondary group. I don't want to obviously dismiss primary heads, but around it's very new. There's an awful lot to thrash out. Ormiston have just, the ink isn't even dry, I don't think, on the contract. So I think certainly it may be, we love a working party, but it may be an idea that we do have a group, or we commit a group from Forum and other primary, secondary governors, head teachers, to look at how that's going to work for us going forward, because it is a very well used service. And I think David makes a very good point in the secondary sector about potential rise in permanent exclusions if the cost goes up, and if we have to make a commitment to dual role.
Really helpful feedback. Thank you, everyone. And I suppose there's a couple of things we're trying to balance here. So we've had great support. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and feedback on our inclusion strategy. One of the aims there that I think we've all signed up to is reintegration, back into mainstream where that's appropriate in a timely way if children do go into alternative provision. So there's that element of our work. As colleagues said, really pleased that we know now with certainty we're going to be working with Ormiston from September, and Nick Hudson, the Chief Exec, former DCS, very experienced guy, is really keen now to be working across the school system, actually in both boroughs. Now he and the team know they're going to be working with colleagues at Latimer, and it's been a really uncertain time for Wasim and Everell and the team, not sure, if you like, who the new provider is going to be. So I think there's something for me about getting over the line for September and giving TBAP colleagues some certainty around the budget. But the third element, and we referred to it earlier, of course, is myself, Anita and colleagues are meeting with the DFE about our deficit reduction plan, and clearly alternative provision is one element of it, and we do have to, I hope colleagues understand, look at the non-statutory elements of what's funded centrally as opposed to what partner schools might fund. But you're really happy, I know, with Hilary, who's over in the far corner, and I think Laura, who's on our live stream, to have that discussion with secondary heads about how we might move forward, and if we need to make changes, of course, we can look at that.
Okay, I mean, if we leave that with you, Ian, to form a group out of here. I think we've got Chris and then Kitty. Chris.
Thank you. I mean, from my point of view, I consider our role here is for these discussions to go on. It's interesting to hear them, but to go on outside. You mentioned about this might increase permanent exclusions. Well, I'd like to see the evidence for that, because that's what, in this scenario, we would be making a judgment on. Very clear evidence about the risks, the balance of risks, and what the focus is here, because my understanding is that the focus is that we're trying to reduce the number of permanent exclusions. Yeah. Okay, I accept exactly what you're saying in relation to the impact that it has on individual schools, but we're not looking at individual schools necessarily here. We're looking at the overall best outcomes for those young people who really struggle in mainstream education. So what I would be expecting to see next is a focus report on the basis of all those discussions that have been had with some clear evidence base as the next step. Thank you.
Ian.
One final point, again, early days, but we are in discussion with early help colleagues and with the third sector about some additional investment we can put into what we're initially terming a North Kensington inclusion pilot. So I recognise that's not whole borough, and there may well be, I think, some initial discussion has taken place with schools about that. So as well as the alternative provision commissioning piece that we and obviously schools are investing in, there's also that opportunity as well. We're very mindful of the points that you've made, Chris, and we really want to support you all to, I suppose, deliver on the inclusion strategy and recognise a spectrum of support, and different types of support are needed at different times.
Thank you, Ian. Kitty.
In early years, we have early intervention, and presumably this is what you'll try and set up, but with some perhaps funding from another source to fund it, perhaps health, because obviously early intervention saves a fortune and a lot of trauma for the schools. The schools can't be expected to manage everything. If it can be, well, it's more efficient if it can be provided as a borough, as a go-to support for behaviour management. And
Yep, thank you, Kitty. Ian, is there anything on that you want to come back on?
Absolutely helpful points here, Kitty, and I think whilst we're obviously looking at the statutory provision, you know, for permanent excluded residents for 5 to 16-year-olds, we are looking about the broader spectrum of support, and the points I just made about the North Kensington Inclusion Pilot, absolutely we would see that reaching across the age range, including very young children as well.
Thank you, Ian. Anything else? Okay, just on that item A11, I just asked the committee to note the report, and we move into A12, any other business, and I know that Anita has an item of any other business which is about Grenfell funding. Anita.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, some good news that the ESFA had previously advised, as we've reported to Forum, that last year was going to be the final year they gave us any funding for schools affected by the Grenfell Tower fire. So I'm very pleased to say that, you know, further to ongoing work with the ESFA, they've now confirmed that we've got a further 543,000 in for 2021-22, but that is the final year. We have to allocate the money for support for schools that recorded lower pupil numbers as a result of the fire, and for pastoral support required as a result. So we're looking at how we allocate that funding, but that's, you know, unexpected good news.
Yes, that is really good news. Thank you, Anita, and a good way to end. Can I just ask on that, obviously within that there's some criteria. Is there flexibility in there, particularly if we focus on, say, certain schools who have financially struggled and are severely impacted, that it might be weighed more in a particular direction?
That is certainly what we're looking at in terms of the schools that are most affected, and yes, and what's happened with their roles, etc. Yes.
Yep. Okay, that's good news, Peter.
Just check I heard the numbers right. Which was 543,000. Thank you.
Correct. Okay, thank you, Anita. Is there any other business, if you raise your hands? Okay, well, that concludes this meeting of the School Forum. Thank you so much for coming. It's been fantastic to see you all in the flesh and live here, and see you all very soon.